The panel is going to talk about the current status of mining law reform, and it will include a discussion of the legislation that is right before Congress now. And finally, this report that Maggie Pittman mentioned yesterday, National Forest on the Edge, and then a few other publications put out by the Forest Service, they are available out at the registration table too. So with that, Bonnie Gestring and mining law reform.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. I work for Earthworks, so I just wanted to let people know that I preface my presentation by saying I'm not an attorney, but I have been working on mining issues for about 10 years, primarily on issues in the Northwest United States. And I was asked to talk about the legislation in front of Congress. I thought I would start with a little background on the mining law and those issues that have been central to the debate, and then talk about the provisions that are in the mining bill that passed the House this year, and talk about what we might expect in the Senate next year. So please jump in if you have questions along the way. Of course, the 1872 mining law is the law that governs hard rock mining, which is the metal mines, copper, gold, silver, platinum, palladium, on federal public lands. And as I always like to say, it was enacted 136 years ago when Ulysses S. Grant was president, and at a time before the light bulb was invented. So it's an old law. And it is the last of the public land giveaway laws that were put in place in the late 1800s by the federal government, really promoting westward expansion and development. Unlike those other laws, the Railroad Land Grant Act or the Homestead Act, which have been revoked or substantially changed, the 1872 mining law remains substantively the same. And the cornerstone of that law is that all valuable mineral deposits in lands belonging to the United States shall be free and open to exploration and purchase. So of course, in that century, in the intervening century since this law was written, a lot has changed. A lot has changed with the way that mining is practiced. A lot has changed with the mining industry, and certainly a lot has changed in the West and how we view and use and place demands on public lands. For instance, when the mining law was written, mining was very small scale, and it was dominated largely by individual prospectors using pretty low-tech equipment. And of course, that's changed dramatically. Today, mining is done on a massive scale. It's generally moving hundreds of millions of tons, in some cases billions of tons of rock, and mining generally low-grade ore deposits. It's also dominated by an industry that has become highly consolidated from a whole vast range of individual prospectors. It's now dominated by a few companies. For example, Newmont, which is a U.S. corporation, and Barrick Gold, which is a Canadian corporation. Those two companies control 66% of U.S. gold production. So in addition to the changes in the way mining is done today and the changes in the mining industry, of course, we have changes in the West, which I think probably previous speakers have touched on. And I'll just talk about the changes, add to that in terms of the changes in demands placed on public lands in terms of mining. Mining tends to fluctuate in response to commodity prices, and we've seen a real increase in metal prices in the last 5 or 6 years, driven largely by the demand for minerals in places like China and India. And in response to that, we see a dramatic increase in the number of claims that have been staked on public lands. So since 2003, the number of claims on public lands in 12 western states have increased by 62%. And this is kind of a difficult graph to see in this room, or map to see in this room, but the dark orange, the colors are represented by the percent of public lands that are claimed by mining interests. And so the darker colors are where you have the highest concentration. The dark orange is 1/5 of the public land in that region is staked with mining claims. The slightly less dark orange is 1/10, and it continues to go up. So it gives you an idea. Nevada being a major gold producer, not only in the U.S. but also globally, certainly sees the highest concentration. And even, for instance, northern Nevada, just to give you a sense of the amount of lands that can be controlled, Newmont owns through mining claims and patented claims 3,000 square miles of land. So there have been dramatic changes in mining and in Western public lands and how the uses and demands. And of course, that has all led to numerous calls for reform of the 1872 mining law to reflect those changes. Those issues that have been most central to the debate are really about 4 or 5 issues. One, of course, is that under the 1872 mining law, mining is considered the highest and best use of public lands. Issues around environmental standards and reclamation criteria, the patenting provision, royalties, and abandoned mines cleanup. So under the 1872 mining law, it's interpreted such that it is the highest and best use of public lands, and federal land managers have little discretion to balance mining with other public land uses, such as wildlife, fisheries, agriculture, water supplies, timber, recreation. And we certainly are hearing that highlighted by leadership within the land management agencies. A recent letter that was sent to the Senate this year by 4 of the 5 preceding chiefs of the U.S. Forest Service have all said, this is a big issue for us. Because our hands are tied under the 1872 mining law, we're still seeing mining in inappropriate locations and circumstances, and we really need to see a change in the law that allows public land, that provides a specific process by which federal land managers can better balance mining with other uses. Royalties are another issue that's been central to the debate because hard rock mining is not required to pay a royalty to the U.S. taxpayer for minerals that are extracted off of public lands. So in contrary to all the other resource extraction industries, coal, oil and gas, they all pay 8 to 12.5% interest, and the hard rock industry pays no federal royalty. An estimated $245 billion worth of minerals have been extracted off of public land. I think that's probably a real rough estimate since we're estimating since 1872. And just as a contrast, the coal industry as of 2000 had generated $6 billion worth of royalties that's been used to clean up abandoned coal mines across the West. Another issue that's been central is certainly environmental standards and reclamation criteria, because the 1872 mining law was certainly written before that was an issue on public lands, and it contains no environmental standards or reclamation criteria. As a result of that, because they weren't thinking about those issues back then, the EPA in a 2000 report estimates that 40% of the headwaters of western watersheds are polluted by mining, and there are roughly 500,000 abandoned mines across the West, many of which are still a significant source of pollution. You can see a couple mines here around Montana. This one here in the middle is the Beal Mountain Mine. It's just up the Clark Fork River watershed on German Gulch, if anyone's from the Anaconda area. It's a gold mine that began operating in the, 89 and closed in 98. It's been closed for 10 years, and it's still a very significant source of water pollution to the headwaters of the Clark Fork River watershed. And it has had adverse impacts on the native West Slope cutthroat trout fishery there as well. And then many of you are maybe familiar with the Mycorse mine that's at the headwaters of the Blackfoot River, our other headwater river here, and that also is a significant source of ongoing pollution. So, of course, in the intervening years, there have been a number of other federal laws that have been put in place: the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. All of those apply to mining, but the argument around reform is that there are no federal standards that are mine-specific, and there are significant gaps within this regulatory structure that continue to allow significant pollution to occur. We also have, of course, states that have put in place reclamation laws, and those are generally applicable to mines on federal lands as well. But the reclamation criteria vary considerably from state to state. So, for example, the state of Idaho doesn't require reclamation of underground mines. The state of Nevada and Alaska allow self-guarantee or self-bonding for hard rock mines. Everyone else requires that it has to be independently guaranteed, the money that will be used for reclamation in the event of a bankruptcy. So there's no consistency across federal lands for the U.S. taxpayer, the American people. And what we see in terms of the regulatory gap is supported by the scientific evidence that's out there. A recent 2006 peer-reviewed study looked at hard rock mines across the West and found that more than 75% of the mines that were reviewed exceeded water quality standards. So we consistently see that. That's certainly reflected in the state of Montana. 9 of the 13 major hard rock mines in Montana have water quality problems that have developed that were not predicted when the mines were permitted. Sortman Landusky, just north central Montana, just south of Fort Belknap Reservation. Substantial acid mine drainage will require water treatment in perpetuity. A massive water pollution problem there up in the Little Rocky Mountains from acid and heavy metals. And the other issue that is the regulatory gaps that we most frequently deal with are gaps that don't provide adequate protection for water and for fish and wildlife habitat. And so you see the same thing reflected in the game management, fish and game management. Recent letter was sent to the Senate once again saying, while things have improved somewhat over the last couple of decades, we're still consistently seeing significant impacts to fish and wildlife from hard rock mining, and we need to see reform of the law that better addresses these problems. Patenting has certainly been an issue. Patenting provision is the component of the 1872 mining law that allows a mining company or individual that has staked a mining claim on federal public lands. If that mining claim is deemed to be valid, there's a discovery of a valuable mineral there, they can purchase that land for $5 an acre if it's a lode claim, or $2.50 an acre if it's a placer claim. Under that provision, there's been 3.5 million acres of public land that have been privatized. And there is no provision in the 1872 mining law that says once it's been patented that it actually has to be mined. So the law has been misused significantly over the years to purchase public lands that are then used for resorts, casinos, a couple brothels in Nevada, a variety of other sort of definite non-mining uses, a few cabins. And the controversy around that led to the passage of a moratorium in 1994 as an amendment to an Interior Appropriations Bill. So everything, all the patent applications that had been in process up until that point have been grandfathered in and are still moving through, and we get patents approved every year for privatization, although it's getting to the end of the list. But it's also an amendment that has to be approved every year by Congress, and there have been efforts to overturn that, the most recent being in 2005 with Representative Pombo from California, who submitted an amendment in order to reauthorize patenting, although increasing it from $5 an acre to $1,000 an acre. That amendment, of course, failed. And another, I guess we've hit all the major issues. So this, of course, there have been numerous efforts to reform the 1872 mining law. In this Congress, a bill was introduced in May by Representative Costa of California and Representative Ray Hall of West Virginia. That bill passed out of the House in November on a 244 to 166 vote. And it does a variety of things. First of all, it substantially increases public land protections, and it does that in a number of different ways. It increases the amount of acreage on public lands that are now off limits to mining in terms of no new claim staking, grandfathers in existing valid claims and operations, things that have already been permitted, but it precludes new mineral entry. So no new claim staking in areas of critical environmental concern, which is a BLM designation, land managed roadless areas under the Clinton rule, wild and scenic rivers, and those that would be eligible for such, and wilderness study areas. It also gives state, local, and tribal governments authority to petition the Secretary of Interior to withdraw lands that are locally important for specific values, say a municipal water supply or fish and wildlife habitat in the area. At present, the federal government is the only entity that can initiate the withdrawal process, and so this would give other state and tribal governments the ability to move that through. It also sets up a process by which the Secretary of Interior would have to process that application. It gives them a timeline, and it requires that the withdrawal be approved unless it can be demonstrated that it would be against the national interest. Another provision in this bill clarifies federal land management authority, in that it clarifies the discretion to deny mine permits. We talked about how the mining law, as it's interpreted today, is that mining is the highest and best use on our federal public lands. In the H.R. 2262, the bill that passed the House, it would allow federal land managers to deny mine that causes undue degradation on federal public lands. And undue degradation is defined as irreparable harm to significant resources that cannot be effectively mitigated. So it is still a pretty high bar when you think about all of those adjectives in there. It's got to be a significant resource, it's got to be irreparably harmed, and it can't be beyond mitigation. But it does provide at least some tools. H.R. 2262 also puts in place environmental standards and reclamation criteria, fairly generally in some cases, and then it calls for a rulemaking by the Secretary of Interior to define a lot of the other standards more specifically. So it provides a list of mining type impacts for which rules need to be promulgated. But in general, a reclamation criteria would be reclaiming to meet sustained pre-mining uses or those that have been identified in an appropriate land management plan. It puts some general criteria for fish and wildlife, and then a couple that are, I think, of note in the surface and groundwater provisions. There's a requirement to preclude water treatment in perpetuity. And we see that in, for example, some of the mines around Montana. The Zortman-Landusky mine, where you have severe acid mine drainage, and all the scientists have agreed that pollution is going to continue as long as we know. For hundreds and hundreds of years, that site will continue to generate acid. It will have to be captured and treated 24/7 for as long as we know, which is very expensive since the mining company has filed for bankruptcy. So this provision is intended to get at that issue, and what it says is that mines must be required to demonstrate up front that they can meet water quality standards within 10 years without treatment, within 10 years of closure. So putting some time frames and saying, yes, we understand as you're closing, there may be some water treatment issues that will need to be resolved, but you need to be able to meet water quality standards without active treatment within a specific amount of time. And I think that will at least get at some of the most severe examples of mines with water treatment in perpetuity. There's also a groundwater provision in there in northern Nevada in particular. This is a huge issue because you have these massive open pit operations, and in order to keep the pits dry while the mines are operating, the groundwater table has to be lowered below the depth of the pit. This is in places where the pit extends below where the water table is situated. And so in that area, the groundwater is because you've got this high concentration of mines along the Carlin Trend, the groundwater has been pulled down around those mines, but it's formed what we call a cone of depression that expands out beyond the mine boundaries. And in northern Nevada, they're seeing effects on a 100 square mile area. So this particular provision is intended to require that mines show in the reclamation plan that they can prevent material damage to the hydrologic balance outside the permit area. So a couple of important additions to environmental standards that are very mine-specific. And then, as I mentioned, rulemaking for a variety of other issues. Also, the HR 2262 would end patenting, which would put it basically where it is today. There's a moratorium in effect. This would put it in statute. The existing applications that were grandfathered in 1994 will continue to go through, but there can be no new patent applications, and once those run out, there'll be no new patenting. It also establishes a royalty, 4% net smelter royalty on existing mines, 8% royalty on new mines. And the Congressional Budget Office estimates that that would generate about $40 million a year of revenue that would go into basically two funds. The mining law would create an abandoned mines cleanup program to deal with the 500,000 abandoned hard rock mines that are present across the West. 2/3 of the money generated by that royalty would go into that fund, and 1/3 would go into a community impact assistance fund, which is intended to deal with communities near mines that deal with the boom and bust effects of hard rock mining. So it's intended to provide some local economic development money that can be used to help them as they're trying to make the transition into a new sort of non-extractive industry type economy. So that's the provision. Once again, there are, the U.S., the EPA estimates that to clean up the abandoned mines across the West, hard rock mines, not coal mines, will cost about $50 billion, so we've got a long way to go with the $40 million a year. And here in Montana, we have, about 3,000 abandoned mines on Forest Service land. The state keeps an inventory of those, and they have identified 150 of the highest priority mines. Those 150 mines are saying will cost about $90 million to clean up, and that doesn't include water treatment, and they haven't actually calculated that. They're able, under the existing money that they have, they get a little money out of the coal program, because the royalties generated by the coal program have been used to clean up the abandoned coal mines in Montana, and so they're now able to allocate coal money towards some hard rock funds, hard rock cleanup, and they clean up about 3 to 4 sites a year, depending, generally smaller sites with those funds. And as I said, the Reclamation Fund and states and tribal governments can tap into the Abandoned Mine Lands Fund and use it for cleanup in their area. And for the attorneys in the room, it increases enforcement provisions. It puts in place a bad actor provision in terms of mining companies that have a record of violations or are currently in violation, can't get a new permit until they've addressed those violations. And citizen suits, which I think is really critical. As a conservation group that works a lot on mining issues. In particular, in Montana, we've had to use citizen suits in almost every case I can think of when it comes to trying to get water quality issues addressed at Zortman. That was done through citizen suits. The Kendall Mine, the ranchers that were affected by Lewistown. It wasn't citizen suits, but it was certainly citizen action pushing for cleanup of the Libby mine up in the northwest part of the state. So really a critical provision in terms of when you're dealing with state or federal agencies that don't necessarily place enforcement of the law as a priority, having citizen suit as a provision that groups can take advantage of, I think is a critical piece of reform. So finally, as I said, the bill passed the House, but it was not taken up by the Senate. And they did not introduce their own Senate bill. So as we sit today in this Congress, we're not likely to see anything happening in the Senate. And so nothing has effectively changed on the ground. We are anticipating that a bill will get introduced in the Senate in the next Congress. There's been some commitments made by some key senators of making it a priority at the beginning of the session. We'll see, of course, there's lots of other issues that are in demand. We've been fortunate in Montana that we've been getting strong support from Senator Tester. And so we're hoping to see some movement in the next congressional session. And I would say, sort of as my final comment here, it's been 136 years. So I would say that it's definitely time for mining law reform. I certainly hope that the next administration will make it a priority along with the next Congress and finish the job that the House did and pass a mining law that provides for better balance of mining with other public land uses, critical, giving federal land managers authority to do that, which is essential, providing a revenue for an abandoned mines cleanup program so we can start cleaning up all of these sites that are this long source of pollution to our streams and to land and to public health, risk to public health. And putting in place, what am I missing? Oh, environmental standards, particularly for water quality protection and fish and wildlife habitat. Those would certainly be the things that I would see as most important in the next Congress. I think that's about it. Yeah. Are there any questions?
What are Senator Bingaman's views on the key components of this bill? Do you know?
Yeah, we were actually anticipating that Senator Bingaman might be introducing a bill this Congress. When the congressional session started, the idea, what was expected was that there was going to be a joint bill between Senator Reid, Senator Bingaman, and Domenici. The negotiations amongst those three senators sort of fell apart throughout the session or didn't get prioritized. And so that didn't happen, and Senator Bingaman, I think, is at a point where he's feeling like he's going to introduce a bill in this next Congress. And I think his general agreement, I think we can expect to see a bill in the Senate that's certainly not as strong as the House bill, but that he agrees and will promote a lot of the same provisions in terms of additional authority for federal land managers. Definitely there's broad agreement, not only through the conservation community and the mining industry and others, about ending patenting and creating abandoned mine lands program. The debate has been about the royalty in terms of what the amount is and whether it's a net smelter or gross and how it's applied and, blah, blah, blah. And then there's debate about the environmental standards and provisions and what specifically those address. So I think he's certainly online on the generalities of all of that.
What do you think the prospects are for getting Superfund actually funded again to address some of these major cleanups?
Yeah, someone else is going to have to speak to that because I don't work on Superfund issues, so I don't know the politics around it. I certainly agree that there needs to be funding for it because we've got, particularly because mining sites, because they're so large, tend to be a major piece of Superfund cleanup. There have been some hearings over the last few years about mega sites, which are the big mine sites and a few other types of sites around the country, because they require so much money, and how do we deal with those sites? And right now, with no money, literally, in Superfund, a lot of these sites aren't getting adequately addressed. And just for an example, what you see, the Beale Mountain Mine up the Clark Fork River, when the company filed for bankruptcy in 1998, and the mine had substantial problems. It was leaking like a sieve, and it was releasing, and it still is, selenium and cyanide into German Gulch. And there was fear that there was going to be failure of the process pond, and we'd have this dramatic release of water. And the Forest Service pulled it into CERCLA, not the Superfund provision, but the, what do we call it? The, I've just lost the short-term emergency removal program. And in order to be able to deal with the site, the problem with that is that the federal agencies have been doing that more and more, and what we're seeing is that under CERCLA, and they're actually now, and I have a very cynical view of this, and but I think they're using it as a way to avoid having to deal with the serious water quality problems at those sites, because under this program, they're not required to meet water quality standards or have a discharge permit. They just have to show progress towards that, following the ARARs, as they're known. And so, for instance, at Beale, we had filed a lawsuit saying water quality standards are violated, you need to have a discharge permit, they need to meet it. It got pulled into CERCLA to avoid that, because the federal and state government didn't want to have to pay. They didn't have the money in hand, and they didn't want to have to pay at that point to be able to put in place the provisions that need at that site to be able to meet standards. So it still isn't. It's been closed for 10 years, and it's still not meeting aquatic life standards for those pollutants. And it's in CERCLA, and it's we're still waiting for the additional reclamation work that needs to be done to address those problems. So that was sort of much longer than you probably were looking for in terms of an answer.
Bonnie, I've got two questions for you. Are there any provisions in any of these reform initiatives to provide funding for the pre-permitting activities that the agencies have to deal with? We've talked about funding shortcomings in a lot of these sessions. And I'm not talking about the abandoned mine land part of it. I'm talking about the permitting that the agencies would have to go through themselves. And then the second question has to do with the royalties that would be generated. Are there any provisions that those royalty funds that would be generated would be used to benefit natural resource management programs such as wildlife or recreation?
Well, currently there hasn't been anything formal that's been put forward at a federal level associated with either of those. So, and I don't know, I just haven't heard any discussion about the issue of needing additional funds up front for the permitting process. I mean, one of the things I think we've all felt is that there needs to be a shift in the way that permitting is done in terms of who's funding the scientific analysis associated with the permitting, and the biases associated with that, and the needing to have some more concrete independence in terms of how that work is done. But I haven't seen anything at a federal level in terms of providing additional funding to make that happen. And similarly, there's been some discussion about, I think, but nothing concrete, certainly by some of the wildlife-focused hunting and angling conservation groups, about, in addition to abandoned mine lands cleanup, which certainly is benefiting fish and wildlife habitat protections, there's certainly been some discussion about allocating some of that money specifically to fish and wildlife agencies to deal with restoration of fish and wildlife habitat, but there isn't anything that's formally out there at this point.
I wanted to ask a little bit about a Good Samaritan provision in this statute, or this act. Will there be one? I know perpetual treatment of water is a real concern, really on both sides. And is there a possibility of including something like that in this provision?
No. Well, and there's always a possibility, but of course it isn't in the bill that passed the House, and I doubt it will be in the Senate because the Good Samaritan bills that have been out there have been somewhat controversial, and I think people have felt, well, we need to separate that out and deal with it. Because there's so much to deal with 1872 reform, putting that in the bill as well will just bog things down further. So we may see a Good Samaritan bill in the next Congress that would be addressed separately from 1872 mining law reform, just because there's a lot of conflict amongst senators, well, representatives and senators around the liability issues, waivers of liability for various entities in order for them to have the interest in going in and doing mining law reform. And so because there's a lot of debate about that and a lot of controversy, I think there's been a real distinct decision to deal with that issue separately.
Time for one last question.
I'd just like to know what Max Bacchus is doing, if anything, on this issue.
Well, there hasn't been a bill in front of the Senate, so he hasn't had to address this. The reason I referenced Senator Tester before is because he's on the Senate committee, and so the Senate held a couple of hearings this Congress, and he attended those and asked great questions and has been real interested in the issue and is interested in providing a leadership role. So I reference him just because there was something for him to do this Congress in terms of his presence on that committee. So we'll see once a bill is in play in the next Congress where Senator Bacchus comes down.
All right, let's thank Bonnie once again. And with that, we're going to jump right into our last panel of the day, and Kyle Nelson is going to introduce our last set of panelists.
Before we wrap things up for the day, we just like the Public Lands and Resource Law Review would like to offer a few thanks to some key people here. First, we'd like to thank all of you for spending the last couple of days with us and be in this discussion of the direction of public lands for the 21st century. Can't thank all of you enough for being here the last couple of days. We'd also like to thank all of the moderators and panelists for leading these discussions and ensuring the conference ran so smoothly. We'd also like to thank Matt McKinney, Sarah Bates, and Sean Johnson, and everyone else at the Public Policy Research Institute for your guys' support. We couldn't have done this without you. I would also like to thank all the sponsors for the generous support. Their support is what really made this happen. And finally, we'd like to thank our conference co-editors, Mike and Jen. They've been working at this since last Christmas with Sarah and Matt, and we can't thank you guys enough for your hard work. And so we have a couple things for you guys. We have a card here, and then here you go. Each a couple of posters to kind of serve as a daily reminder that the conference is now over and they can relax. And some of you may not know this, but it's a well-known fact within the law review and the law school that Jen and Mike have exceptional fashion sense, and we've got them each a little something to kind of add or strengthen to their wardrobe arsenal. So thank you guys both so much. To get this last panel going then, the last panel is entitled Realizing the Vision, the Next Steps in the Public Lands Agenda for the 21st Century. And this will be a discussion of revision, finalization, and implementation of the policy report based on the feedback received by the conference speakers and all of you, the attendees. To facilitate this discussion, it will be led by our own Professor Ray Cross. He's a professor at the University of Montana School of Law, and Dr. John Freemuth, who is the Senior Fellow at the Cecil D. Andrus Center for Public Policy and Professor of Political Science and Public Administration at Boise State University. Please join me in welcome Professor Cross and Professor Freemuth.
First, let me make sure that you can hear me. Fine. I'd like to add my thanks to Jennifer and to Mike, as well as Matt and Sarah for their organization. It's just a wonderful conference, and the fact that you've stayed to hear the final panel attests to that. So thanks to them, and thanks to you for coming out and supporting the conference. Also, my thanks to the staff, editors of the Public Land and Resources Law Review for taking on this long-term effort over 32 years to keep this conference as vibrant and as significant in the public land law area as it is. My charge, along with John's charge, is to sort of stimulate the discussion. So really, this hour is dedicated to getting your feedback on the step forward, the way forward in this next phase of action for the policy report. And I'd like to do that by kind of taking a look at the three narratives, the three dominant themes that I've taken away from this conference. And I'm going to sort of characterize those themes, not necessarily as I support them or believe them, but as I think I've emerged from this conference. And I hope it's of some use to you to think about the public lands within this new view. The first dominant theme I call the restoration narrative of the public lands. The idea that we're going to preserve our way out of the problems that we're faced with on the public lands. The second narrative I call the knowledge-based understanding of public lands. The hope, the idea that we're going to scientize our way out of the problem of public lands. The third major narrative I've taken away from this conference is that of good and wise governance, that we're going to regulate and plan our way out of the problems of the public lands. And I'd like to first speak about this idea of restoration, the sort of new kid on the block that sort of promises a whole lot, but as of yet may not have delivered much. And I'd like to talk about, in part, where this comes from, in the broader scheme of things, perhaps a Rebecca Tosi view, a Native American view. And what I see as the restoration narrative's source is based on this idea of a timeline, the before us timeline, before the European settlement, development of the North American continent. That's the before us, some 400 years ago. At that time, America constituted an ecologically whole, self-sustaining, complete ecosystem. After us, after the eras of acquisition, the eras of disposal that we study in public land law, what once was whole is now broken and fragmented. This powerful, potentially strong narrative of restoration speaks of redemption and has potentially broad appeal, cutting across a wide array of divides and boundaries. Revamping this idea of restoration into one of stewardship may very well speak to the emerging evangelical youth that sees strongly their role in carrying out the plan of taking us toward a stewardship idea of conservation, preservation, and restoration. The second, the knowledge-based ideal or narrative, the belief that somehow we can scientize our way out of the problems of the public lands is based on evolving new scientific theories, not completely understood and not completely fleshed out. Ideas of conservation biology, ideas of learn as you go through adaptive management. And there's competing ideas, is that we can know and understand nature. This belief that nature has a certain sort of anatomy, physiology, an economy that we can study from different interdisciplinary perspectives and come to some consensus. There's a strong view. This strong view of knowledge-based and science-based understanding believes that conservation biology holds the key. One of the main thinkers is Reed Noss, wrote a book called Nature's Legacy, talks about very specific prescriptions as to how to achieve this restoration principle based on conservation theories. The weak view of this scientized idea is much more humble, much more self-critical. That's the science that says now, perhaps we are wrong. Perhaps these static views of nature and climax and succession was wrong. Perhaps we need something called punctuated equilibrium, a dynamic, ever-changing, not measurable nature. And this is the view of Karl Popper. This is the view of Thomas Kuhn, the theory that even science is not free of values, and that science ultimately cannot be the arbiter and tiebreaker of what are basically social and human decisions. One might think back to that first scientist, a fellow named Roger Bacon, arguably the first scientist. And he distinguished between two types of knowledge. One he called proud knowledge, the other he called lowly knowledge. He made those distinctions because he was caught up in something called the Copernican conflict. And in order to save his own head, he thought of science's role, as being to advise society, but not to dictate to society. So, the scientist idea. The third model is the good governance model. And this is the dominant narrative right now, the good, wise governance model. And that good and wise governance model was offered partly as a political rationale, partly as a managerial rationale for the retention and management of the public lands by the federal government at the turn of the 20th century. This idea that we can plan and we can regulate our way was originally embodied in a concept called MUSI, multiple use and sustained yield, a utilitarian-based calculus in which you take a look at the evolving needs of the American people, and the goods and commodities that come from the public lands are calibrated to those changing demands. Now, there's also a structural view that it has a command and control component, a very strong command and control component favored by Gifford Pinchot. And this idea, in light of the evolving democracy, the evolving theories of public participation, the evolving demands for participation by the American people in once was an opaque, closed-door process, try to flatten that hierarchical idea, try to provide new entry through changing and adjusting concepts of what's called standing to allow new players, public interest organizations and lawyers, through statutory enactments called citizen suits, which attempt to empower private attorney generals to bring a broader authorizing environment and flavor to that regulation and planning process. Recently, there's been quite a reaction to this idea of flattening the hierarchy. You'll notice recent Supreme Court decisions instituted a strong definition of what's called deference, the Chevron deference rule, in which it's not the place of the federal judiciary to second guess administrative rules or administrative choices. And recent restrictive interpretation of the baseline law that allows parties to sue, private aggrieved parties, called APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, strictly interpreted under SUA to say, in effect, that discretionary choices not subject to judicial review. Agency inaction doesn't fall within the jurisdictional grants to the federal courts to review agency indifference to statutory mandates such as wilderness. So we see this continuing battle. And as I say, it's not my place, and I'm not really championing one of these narratives over the other. But I'd like you to think about these narratives as sort of the dominant themes that have dominated our public land law debate for the past history of the people, us, in America. And I'd like to now look at a critique of these narratives. These narratives have really undergone a real sound thrashing, at least in academia. And the critical thinkers, the critical theorists, critique these narratives as nothing more than window dressing. Each of these narratives are sort of backdoor ways of allocating power, making hidden choices, dressing up those choices that are really basically power allocations to varying groups in our society. And that's one of the questions I think you have to ask. And there's also this deeper view called social construction theory. And the social constructionists say that really wilderness, conservation biology, the Endangered Species Act are sort of our imposed societal constructions that seek to kind of tame nature to our control and management. Now, I don't really buy into social construction all that much. As critical as it sounds, it doesn't cut very deeply. Really, what's always been true in my mind has been this idea that it's concepts that drive history and shape people. The trick is finding the right idea at the right time, as against the wrong idea at the wrong time. So choosing between these narratives, that's going to drive the public land debate forward. I'd like to suggest sort of a counter-narrative. And once again, I'd like to give my colleague Rebecca Tosi some credit for jogging my thinking in this regard. This counter-narrative, this counter-historical theory, this counter-ideal. If you remember the story that we've all been taught about the Garden of Eden, Eve and Adam breaking their bond of obedience by eating an apple from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's an old Hebraic myth that starts the history of that people in the book of Genesis. There's an updated modern version, very sexy, very powerful, very poetic, written by John Milton, called Paradise Lost, in which, in a much expanded epic poetic tradition, he tries to explain the yearning of all peoples, not just the English people, for liberty and self-determination and freedom. Himself being a victim of a political boil-up known as the short-lived English Republic and the follow-on glorious restoration of James I to crush that rebellion and the Republic. Anyway, in this story, this version of Genesis, this story of our modern concept of ourselves, John Milton has the archangel Michael come down and speak directly to an almost suicidal Adam an Adam that does not want to leave the Garden of Eden, that will do harm to himself if he's compelled to leave. So the archangel Michael comes down and says, now wait a minute, buck up. There's a new thing, and it's called history. You have created not just evil, but you have created history. History flows only one way, on a straight line. And you're the author of that history. You, your seed, have the power within your grasp to redeem history, to end history, to restore the garden. Armed with that knowledge, that through the people's action, his people's action, by that token, all of us, since it's now spoken to all of us, our action to restore faith in those ideals that we had lost. So the way I'd like to think is not of history as linear, not as the beginning of history when those first ships showed up on the eastern seaboard and everything else was a prehistory of America. But I'd like to go back to some Native American tradition that think of history as a circle and a people's experience as merely one aspect of being. And in this regard, history doesn't have that sort of plot to it, the beginning, middle, and end of Genesis, or even of redemption. It has a far more complex character in that the living environment is merely one aspect of being, features that you can perhaps destroy, but never completely. This idea of sort of a conservation law in which being itself will always abide. One talks about trying to read from the book of nature, the sort of proud knowledge that Roger Bacon rejected in favor of lowly knowledge. It may well be, despite all our best efforts, our best scientists, our best plans and regulations, regardless of how much money we pump into the various regulatory agencies, it may well be that this book can't be read, that there's a nature's narrative that's closed to us, and that some think we should not try to read, the proud knowledge approach, to fully decode nature, to fully command sort of even our own genes. And it's interesting to me as a Native American, teach public land law, go to these conferences, because it seems to me that every conference is always a fraught event, contesting groups, contesting narratives, contesting theories. And I hope one day, under the tutelage of someone like perhaps Rebecca Tosi, everybody steps back and take a deep breath. Maybe there's a nature's narrative over and above man's narrative. And in nature's book and in nature's narrative, things come out okay and right. Not that we may think they're okay and right. But in this nature's narrative, we can all agree with that great German realist, jurist, and legal scholar, Hans Kelsen, who said, to accept is to forgive. I think we have to engage in some degree of acceptance of our own role, our own perhaps even complicity in some of the problems we've created within our public lands. And insofar as we understand and accept, we'll realize that this plot of history that we're offered, this linear theory of a people, is perhaps the wrong one, because it requires heroes and villains. It requires conflict and catharsis. It requires that if we get riled up, we need a good story and a good rationale and a good reason. I've been through so many water fights, Klamath Basin, battles over unrecognized Indian tribes in the Sonora Desert, conflicts over large dams that basically have flattened and destroyed all our major river systems, turned them into flat water lakes. So a lot of the Indian people know the narrative better than almost anyone else in America, perhaps stretching from 13,000 years ago, let alone 400. So I'd like to think that a long view of that narrative offers us some hope. That there's a nature's narrative out there somewhere, a book written, perhaps as we speak, that basically turns out okay. Its resilience, its intelligence, if you will, its capacity for self-transformation will make all our efforts at planning and control sort of, if not irrelevant, sort of coin. It's not to say we shouldn't try. It's not to say that we shouldn't struggle. It's not to say we shouldn't question. But we should understand it as Roger Bacon did, that there's a well distinction between proud and lowly knowledge. And we should strive, I think, to be humble. We should strive to be considerate of others. We should strive to be thoughtful in our discussions. And that's our role, as much as we can have one, and what nature does. Thank you.
Well, first, job well done to the University of Montana, Matt, Sarah, the law students. I think this is a good starting point for lots of things to come later. A couple of quick announcement points first. If you want to provide comments on the draft report, Matt has suggested get them to him by October 3rd. He has promised, Matt, to have the final out in early December, when there'll be a, I guess you could say, a transition team actively working, whoever they might be. And after I'm done, sort of, my remarks are sort of geared to, well, where do you move from here, as it were? We'll have some time for your suggestion and comments, I believe, and they will be recorded and captured too. So they will go into the record, as it were, as well as your written comments. Well, where do you move from here, or we move from here? I think it goes back and starts at the beginning with John Leshy. In my view, I'm a political science professor, so I'm going to have those biases. But John Leshy is right. Public lands are not going to be high on the next administration or congressional agenda. That is probably not likely at all. With the economy, foreign conflict, and so forth there, I don't think they're going to hit the ground with a sort of a strategic initiative about reforming federal lands. Now, there's opportunity there, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but it's not a big deal, except perhaps in energy. One of the things I used to do a while ago is I chaired the BLM Science Advisory Board back when they had such an animal, and I do remember that in the early part of the Bush administration, it was pretty clear, and we were briefed that BLM was now moving ahead to looking at how to produce energy in the public lands and trying to find the obstacles therein and try to remove them as much as possible, which is probably another way to say that the Science Advisory Board didn't last much longer because they didn't really talk to us too much about, how they might effectively use science to mitigate there. But the point is that's what started, and the next administration, whether they be Republican or Democrat, will continue the use of and development in some capacity of energy on the public land. So in that sense, public lands will be there, I think. I think we also have to consider that while we all gather and talk about public lands, we see these counter things going on where visitation and enjoyment of the outdoors is down in the national parks and other places. We're moving into a culture that is not the culture of the late 60s, when people predicted that by this time the parks and the wilderness areas would be overrun with people. They forgot, of course, that our knees would get sore and we wouldn't be doing what we were doing when we were young. But on the other side, the demands are different. This is a whole nother game. I mean, some of you have probably experienced this. I used to be a park ranger a long time ago. The further you go east, the further they don't know who's in what uniform. The Washington Post didn't understand the difference between roads in national forests and national parks in one of its editorial. So when we sit here and talk a lot about federal lands, we're the attentive public. We pay attention. A lot of the American public is a little confused, to say the least, about the public land estate. That, I think, coupled with other issues in all of our on all of our agendas, as it were, is going to mean that public lands, it's not going to be one of the driving issues, I don't think, of the next administration, certainly at the beginning. Now, towards the end or the middle, that's a different story, as we saw with the national monuments under President Clinton, and I am sure there will be some attempt to have some sort of Bush legacy on the environment. I don't know what that would be exactly, but he does have the Antiquities Act and some other things. Now, how does policy change? Well, some other things we'll need to continue as this moves along. People have looked at policy, a lot of it has to do with an idea whose time has come, all right? A lot of that has to do with luck and timing, too. I mean, there was an idea for a long time, and I'm not talking about how it sort of has failed a little bit on the economy, but for a long time, deregulation was kicked around from policy wonks and other people. And finally, both Democrats and Republicans and President Carter came about the idea, well, let's try deregulating something and see what happens. And we deregulated the airlines. Now, some of us can have seen the good benefits from that, cheaper fares. The law students, the younger folks in class may not remember that when we used to fly 30 years ago, we all dressed like this, right? We didn't carry tires into the overhead bins to stick them up there because these become flying buses. And now there's about 2 airlines left. I mean, what happened is we deregulated. It had consequences, some anticipated, some unanticipated. But it was an idea whose time had come. Changes in indicators and a perceived crisis may force public lands back to the top. Perhaps climate change indicators will drive concern about federal land management. I joked with Matt and Jim Birchfield at break that if we want to bring public lands back to the top of the attention, let's wait for a warm windstorm this next summer, go light a bunch of fires, spend $1 billion, the Forest Service will implode. We can then say, well, we've got a crisis and we need to do something about federal lands. I say that humorously, but that's how things happen a lot in public policy. They don't happen systematically after long thought and deliberation many times. Perhaps those policy people have carried these conversations on like you have, but it'll be windows of opportunity, luck and timing, things like that, that may bring it all about at some point down the road. I think one event that will give some attention to public lands that might be an opportunity to do something, and I think having that report ready, Matt, and others might be of help, is the GAO is doing a review of whether the Forest Service might be moved into the Department of Interior. They're not making a recommendation, but they're looking at it. Well, when that comes out, that's a small window of opportunity that just opens up to talk about, well, gee, and this opens up the question of other federal lands issues, or perhaps that becomes the first step of a larger conversation about federal lands that goes beyond simply the Forest Service. Now, more specifically for what the University of Montana might do, since it's assumed a leadership mantle here, which is good, to move this conversation along, well, a couple of things will be that I might suggest is we all have to pay attention, and some of you know this well. The modern university is not the university it used to be. Perhaps all of our marching orders now is funded research. That's what we're about. We're not about necessarily undergraduate education, in my view, like we ought to be. We're not even about whimsical research, like the presentation that just came before me was pretty profound stuff, but it's a little bit whimsical, and I can't think of anybody who's going to give you $1 million to do that. Universities are about, you can always hope. Universities are much about big science and big engineering right now. That's what's driving the university conversation, or perhaps you win the Fiesta Bowl like we did, and you get some notoriety, but those things come and go. So hopefully there's a way to position this conversation, and I've gathered there is, that people might be interested in funding this and moving it down the road a little bit. I think it's important, but that sort of becomes how you do some of this, is you get somebody interested in that. More specifically, I noticed when I came here, the draft report was out, but there are 2 more reports that came out of the University of Montana. Jim and Martin Nye's came out, and Dan Chemis's came out. This is all good, but what I'd urge you to do is make sure you're coordinating that as much as possible, so the university's got sort of one voice about where the conversation is going and being led. Rather than, well, this is interesting, but how does it relate to this one, and all of that sort of business. I think the effort, too, needs a focal point in a leadership direction. My view is conversations on the public lands are an interdisciplinary conversation. Law is huge, but so is public policy. So is science, so are the other social sciences, and so forth. And I would urge people to think about how to grow that systematically throughout the University of Montana. The law school can be very important, and we, I think, on the advisory board would like to be the catalyst for some of this, to help make recommendations and to grow it as much as possible. We're all interested from different perspectives in federal lands, federal land policy and law issues, and I can't speak for my colleagues, but knowing some of them well, like Bob Kiter and others, I think we'd be more than willing to help out there as advisors who have any particular agenda or concern at the University of Montana, but just trying to help the university really position itself in that direction. I'd also urge that some sort of a working group, a study group, get formed that has a manageable task and can keep talking about this in ways, and this is going to be strategic, that if that window of opportunity does open, there's something that can be delivered right away. It cannot be too academic, all right? A long report with 5,000 footnotes ain't going to get read, all right? But a focused thing with some key points that's got some wide-ranging people endorsing it, that might get read. All right, we academics can study things to death and write books, and that's all well and good. I can't think of that many books that necessarily influenced public policy, but a focused report, that could. And of course, the point would be that the working group have people that are willing to work well with others, that don't have their own agenda that they're trying to overwhelm the group with, though everybody brings agendas to things like that, and that the group can work on a couple of key big ideas. Here I'm a big fan of history. We may not be able to have another conservation movement or necessarily an environmental movement we had in the 70s, but you gotta admit those were movements around a couple of key concepts that galvanized people. They weren't arcane splitting of hairs about improving forest planning. Not that that doesn't need to be talked about, but there has to be a big idea that's driving that, all right? Which leads me to one of the things that I've found very useful about public land conversations, and you've got to do this informally, but talk to the people in the land management agencies. Too. Have beers with them. Get them out and get their sense of what's going on, what they think might allow them to function better, and run these ideas by them. You know, too often I know, because I talk to them a lot, we talk to them, we don't listen to them about their concerns. They see it day to day, and they've got some interesting, well, that's not going to work because, or have you thought about this? You know, one of the things, I have told the Forest Service, because we have to suffer through it in universities, is they've had management initiative after management initiative that's driving them insane. Right-sizing, downsizing, reinvention, this, that, and the other thing. And after a while, you just give up with that, because certainly most people that go to work for that agency and other agencies didn't go to work to do that crap, right? They understand it's there, but they want to be out on the land or working with people. And yet, I don't think people outside those agencies understand the internal culture and pressures that they have to deal with, but they might have insights about, how to help free some of that up, I guess you might say. And I guess the last point I would suggest is and I do hope the idea of some sort of a working group with some clear tasks comes out of this and you move ahead, because I sure would like to be part of it, however small, is to think through try to think through some causes a little bit of how we got here. And they're not just, Jack Ward Thomas is right. There are a lot of laws that conflict, but there's more subtle causes at play behind a lot of this too. I would in fact argue that part of what happened to some of these agencies, I almost want to say it was deliberate, that there are people who would just as soon like to see some federal land management agencies just go away. And one of the ways you do this is to overwhelm them with more tasks, cut their budgets, and downsize them all at once, and then say, why the hell can't you do your job? Why don't we just get rid of you? All right? I don't think that's just accidental in some cases. I'm not placing blame on any individuals, but if I wanted to destroy the Forest Service, this is just about how I do it, okay? Incentives matter. The economists are right here. We got to listen to them. They don't have to be economic incentives, but we all behave based on incentives, right? As a professor, if I get rewarded for being a good teacher, that's what I'm going to do. If I get rewarded for bringing in grants, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to respond to those incentives like everybody else does. And so those things matter. And we want to think through the implications of what we're suggesting, even though we may not be right. But whatever we do, it won't end up that way completely. There are always unforeseen things. Who knew forest planning? Well, Dick Behan maybe did. Some of you who know who he was, great forestry professor, I believe both here and at NAU, said at the beginning, this ain't going to work. And there's always a few people that warn things, but generally, who would have foreseen some of the implications of that? We always have to sort of be attentive. We talk about adaptive management. You have to pay attention to reforms and make sure constantly they're going where you think they're going to go. And finally, we have to think in simplicities again. Big ideas that can galvanize people. C. Sanders, who I never worked with when he was governor of Idaho and Secretary of Interior, and I think he was a fairly effective leader, both as governor and certainly in Alaska, if nothing else, for the Alaska lands. He used to tell students when I would have him come and I work with him, if you can't say what you're trying to do on a page or a page and a half to a decision maker, forget it. They don't have time to read an academic, complicated, what the heck is in here kind of report. And I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but that's what everybody needs to strive to do, is simplify and try to see if there's a big idea or two that can galvanize, like the conservation movement was able to do, or some of the environmental movement was able to do. And again, we just have to be humble in a different way, that Americans are driven by lots of concerns right now that transcend and go way beyond the public lands. And so we're gonna do this in a context where people, especially with the new administration, everybody's gonna be trying to get their issue on that administration's agenda at the same time. And there is no way they can comprehend everything. In fact, when they try to do that too holistically, they clutch up for a while. They simply can't do that. And so I would advise folks to move ahead, keep something going, move it as quickly as possible, and be ready when the opportunity does arise, because at some point it will. It just probably won't be January 21st. What would I think we'd like to do now, right, Matt and others, is to hear from anybody who has particular concerns about the report or what wasn't discussed over the last day and a half that at least needs to be, marked in this conversation so everybody can think about it as they revise the report. Is that the plan? And what, to go till about, well, as long as people want to talk, but at least 25 minutes of that, if you want to at this point.
I'd like to make a statement about experience that I had during the Reagan administration while he was governor in California. And this all goes in conjunction with Professor Fremont's statement about simplicity in government and the need to take advantage of a situation when that situation occurs. I don't know how many of the audience here, certainly my age and maybe those approaching my age, will remember the Watts riots in Southern California. That was an extremely serious problem during Reagan's administration as governor of California. At that particular time, I served on an advisory board, and I was also president of the Business and Professional Association in Berkeley, California. Reagan sent his agency or his staff to Berkeley because Berkeley at the time was the hotspot of riots in California. I was approached, and along with my staff, we were requested to see what governmental agency could assess the riot problems throughout California, primarily in Southern California, and see how to handle the problem. We came up with the solution that there was no present California governmental agency that could address the problem, and we suggested a separate agency directly dealing with that particular problem of the disadvantaged minorities in California. And what we came up with was a program entitled, we called it Opportunity Through Ownership, which was OPTO for short. And we did not receive any government injection of money, but Reagan insisted that we go to the public sector for all of our needs. I had numerous meetings with Governor Reagan, and just as an example of how politicians can assist in preparing or setting up an agency to deal with a significant problem, I presented our plan to Governor Reagan. He had his staff review it, and they approved the plan wholeheartedly, but Reagan said, absolutely no California money involved. So I asked him, I said, how do you propose that we raise the money? At that time, we were requesting about $7 million to implement the plan, which probably would be $40, $50 million today. Reagan said, let's approach the banks. So at that time, he called his secretary in, and on the speakerphone, I was in his office. He contacted the president of Bank of America and told the president that we had a plan to implement the problems with the disadvantaged minorities in California, and he wanted Bank of America to look at the plan. I went down to San Francisco and met with the Bank of America president and his staff. Everybody liked the plan, but they turned it down because it did not comply with the statutory requirements of the federal banking laws. I went back to President Reagan, or Governor Reagan, told him of the problems associated with the turn down by Bank of America. He then called up Bank of America again, and in speaking to the man, he said, I understand you spoke with my man about this plan for the disadvantaged minorities, And a fellow from Bank of America said, yes, we looked at the plan, we like the plan very much, but it does not comply with banking regulations. Reagan then said, could you tell me offhand how much money does the state of California hold in your bank? So the man said, well, offhand, Governor, I don't know exactly, but I would say that in our particular bank, the state of California has about $300 million on hand. So
Can we, just so some of the other questions can we kind of summarize the key thing we want to get everybody?
summarize
Okay.
it real fast.
Good.
The bank president said, you have approximately $300 million in our bank. Reagan said, fine. If you want that money to remain in your bank,
There you go.
he said, I would suggest that you work with my man in finding a way to solution. Conclusion, Bank of America, along with 7 major banks in California, came up with the required money. We set up the program, and through that program, we were able to finance over 300 minority-based businesses in California. Very successful program. Reagan saw that you cannot go, there's too many levels in government to, let's put it another way, there's an old cliche, too many chiefs and not enough Indians. The money is spent on the chiefs, very little money gets down to the Indians to implement the programs that have been established. And that's true with every government agency there is today, including the land program.
I believe in universities we call that indirect cost, right? Other comments that people want to make sure that gets recorded today? That, and again, if you know, obviously you can send them to Matt too, but I want to make sure anybody who would like to speak here while we have a little time to offer some stuff, and as his insights did about leadership and a crisis, we get them in there.
Thanks. I do want to thank Professor Cross for his very inspiring talk and to offer us a bit of a different paradigm. And you know, it's you see that bumper sticker, you know, challenge the dominant paradigm, and I think it's important to continue to step back and think there may be ways forward that are sort of outside of our traditional ways of thinking. And my second point is that, you know, I think, and I hope the report highlights that, you know, sort of by happenstance and accident and laws and litigation, we have ended up with this incredible resource. You know, 150 years after Yellowstone became a park, we have something that is incredibly precious in this country, and that is 1/3 of our land base. And I hope that your report reflects some passion and belief that as a country, you know, we have this resource that maybe no other country in the world has, and that if we're looking for, you know, a theme or a message, a way, people aren't going to get excited about forest plan revisions and whether the ESA consultation, Section 7, I mean, forget that stuff. No one cares about that, but I think we can be passionate about our public land base and how it is a precious resource.
Other comments, questions?
Do I adjourn it, Matt, or does someone else would like to adjourn it? Jennifer?
Well, we would like to thank everyone for coming and remind you that we have the Forest Service publications outside and also Dan Chemis's publication, and they're free. We have lots of them. If they're not at the table, just ask someone for one. And also, you'll find in the conference materials we have an evaluation form, and your input is so valuable to us. We really want to know what we could do better, what we did well. So just drop those off at the registration table also. And thank you very much.
Thank you.